bit of advice. Never piss in a toilet you recently bleached. Doesn't end well. Anyway, that's not what we're here to discuss. We're here to talk about what makes horror scary. And these guys are going to help us answer that question. But first and foremost, what is horror? As a genre, horror is work of speculative fiction intended to frighten, scare, disgust, or startle its observers by inducing said feelings. In short, elicit fear for entertainment. Okay, neat. But how do we determine what is scary? Allow me to introduce you to my good friend, situational context. Picture this scenario. It's your brother's birthday, and everybody else voted on going to the zoo. Yippee. After a few exhibits, you decide to embark on a solo journey in search of one of those neat little wax mount things that transforms your quarters into a giraffe. Along the way, an unconscious horde emerges over the horizon's crest. Their sunburned faces remain mindlessly adhered to a wall of glass before them, behind which resides a giant orange feline upon a rock. At this point, you're likely pulling one of these numbers and ultimately feel more curious about the tiger than anything. However, let's say instead that you and some buddies decide to go on a camping trip. Somewhere in this neck of the woods. And posted all around your campsite are big yellow warning signs stating, "Haha, tigers go grr." About half an hour in, nature begins its call. But, those Huggies are feeling a bit heavier than they normally do, and there are no bathrooms to be found anywhere. With no other options to spare, you're forced to settle for the next best thing. A bush down yonder. In the midst of assuming the position, however, a rustling emanates before you. Now, regardless of how high you rolled on the perception check, I can state in confidence that when you lock eyes with Tony, it's all too apparent that his flakes aren't quite so frosted after all. Ergo, situational context.
To vastly oversimplify the matter,
our interpretations of these situations are heavily reliant on logical and emotional communication within the brain. Our response to fear is heavily dictated by the amygdala. These tiny almond-shaped things located inside each cerebral hemisphere play a major role in determining the emotional importance of a stimuli. What we see, hear, and feel in a given moment of stress is relayed back to the amygdala. If deemed a threat, it will prepare the body for fight or flight response by saying, "Hey stupid, that thing's dangerous." This distress signal then pulls a page out of Mulan's handbook by cascading this information throughout the body, releasing stress hormones and triggering the sympathetic nervous system. Or the SNES for short. Heart rate increases, vision narrows, and non-essential organs functionality slows down. Just to name a few things. There is, however, an override program that can prevent this escalation. Calling back to the logical conversation, when faced with a stressor, the brain runs a series of fact checks against any memories, innate or acquired fears, as well as general information relevant to the circumstance. You see, there's this fun little thing called the hippocampus, which sounds absolutely ridiculous. However, it works concurrently with the prefrontal cortex to help substantiate these contextual claims. Again, to oversimplify, the hippocampus is crucial in the storing of episodic memories, context, and the prefrontal cortex in dictating behavioral response. If said response has merit, then it's given the all clear. If not, however, we experience the biological equivalent of a veto. Which, referring back to the zoo scenario, is why those poorly sunscreened tourists remain fixed in time. They have context as to what an enclosure is, an understanding of the barrier between them, and reassurance from the surrounding crowd. As such, they deem the situation as non-threatening. Now, if this were 6th period, and I told you to memorize all that for tomorrow's pop quiz, then you'd likely begin to exhibit a fear response. But lucky for you, school is out indefinitely, so let's get back on track and bring in the boys. Consistent amongst these greats of horror are characters exposed to circumstances they are unqualified to handle. The Silence of the Lambs pits an FBI student in training against who is considerably the most formidable opponent to even a seasoned agent.
Morning.
Salem's Lot forces a writer and a 12-year-old to face off against Alucard and his army of darkness, who, by the way, has been playing Cabela's big game hunter with humanity for centuries. And Silent Hill 3 exposes a teenage girl to what effectively is Rob Zombie's interpretation of Stranger Things. So why does vulnerability make horror scary? Because it substantiates the situational context. Let's bring back the zoo example for a moment. Vulnerability in this scenario would be the sudden absence of a glass wall. When you reassess the scene with this new bit of information, what was once a calm and curious encounter suddenly becomes that of life or death. Salem's Lot epitomizes what it means to be vulnerable. Both the town and its people are at the mercy of the outside world. Conceptually speaking, small towns within themselves are becoming ever more enigmatic as they fall victim to the pervasiveness of infrastructure. These ordinary people, familiar with the names and faces of every neighbor, are heavily flawed, and as such, are easily exploitable, which is precisely what happens. Barlow capitalizes on these vulnerabilities to overcome the town. Matt's compassion, Ben's love of Susan, Mark's parents, and even Callahan's faith instantaneously become weaponized. Speaking of which, the assault of the Petrie household is a great example of this. In the book, Father Callahan and Mark try desperately to convince his parents of the vampire's existence within their town. Mark's father, however, is dismissive of their claims, deeming them to be impossible. Suddenly, all is dark. Barlow deftly crashes through their window, and without a moment's notice, betrayal defines their ignorance. Mark's parents are killed in one foul swoop as Callahan draws his cross to ward him off. Unfortunately, he is unsuccessful in doing so before Mark is taken hostage. As he pleads for the boy's life, Barlow responds with a challenge, a confrontation, faith to faith, without the aid of a crucifix. Callahan agrees, and the master vampire lets Mark go. He delays in casting aside his cross. However, as Barlow approaches, what once served as protection abandons him in the moment he needs it most. His faith. It's an incredibly scary scene to read considering the context surrounding his vulnerability. He knows something to be an absolute truth, yet the very people he's trying to save stand in disbelief of it. Additionally, what little defense he has against them is unstable because of his pre-established insecurities about his own faith. In a preceding event, after being brought up to speed on the vampire situation, Callahan admits to himself a terror worse than any he's ever experienced in life. A fear for his immortal soul. It's at the precipice of their fight that this fear is realized. His faith falters, his soul becomes tainted, and life as he knows it is lost. Only an empty husk remains behind, an eternal observation of his shortcomings. If instead we were to consistently observe our characters overcome these obstacles with a practiced efficiency, then any hopes of substantiation for the audience are abolished. Why? Situational context. This repetition of success conditions us to believe that the risk factor is negligible. Our protagonists have proven themselves capable time and time again, so why would this one be any different? As a result, this episodic information gets stored. Sound familiar? If you combine that with a backstory of extensive training and give them equipment to do it more efficiently, then not only is your tension boiled down to that of a limp noodle, but also your characters feel more like deities than human beings, so there's no reason to feel scared on their behalf. Such is why vulnerability substantiates a fear response. Alright, problem solved. It's what I would say if that were all there were to it. It's one thing for a character to be vulnerable, but if we can't empathize with them in the first place, then who cares? There's a reason we cheer when this little shit gets his just desserts. The role of empathy in horror is unique in that it allows us to project ourselves into the characters while simultaneously flipping the table such that now we are the ones with something to lose. This loss may refer to a character we've grown particularly fond of, or even our own innocence through empathizing with a villain. What's interesting about The Silence of the Lambs is that it somehow manages to do both. From the opening scene alone, we know that Clarice Starling is fighting an uphill battle. As mentioned previously, Starling is a student in training at the FBI Academy. At the request of her mentor, she's sent to perform an interview with the infamous psychiatrist and cannibalistic serial killer, Dr. Hannibal Lecter. Along the way, she receives numerous warnings detailing the capabilities of this monstrosity. The closer she gets to the source, the more atrocious his mythos become. The last of which, delivered by Frederick Shilton, a man we somehow grow to hate more than the one who actually ate people. As she descends the corridor towards Lecter's cell, the inmates in passing grow ever more animalistic in comparison to the latter. Upon arriving at her destination, however, she's met with an individual initially so calm and collected that they seem contradictory by nature. The vile tales preceding him suddenly become undermined by his tranquil demeanor. At this point, the film has already accomplished several things to build upon empathy. It establishes Starling as an underdog, a mutual disdain for Chilton, and the validity of Lecter's character is called into question. What I'd mainly like to explore, however, is the empathy of the lamb. The lamb represents innocence, something sacred to be protected from the prowling wolves. Over the course of the film, both the lamb and the wolf don many forms. From literal lambs led to slaughter by man, to the victims preyed upon by Buffalo Bill, to Starling herself, from both our perspective and Lecter's. The fact that we can empathize with Lecter from this perspective is largely what makes him so terrifying. We know of his past, and we've seen with multiple MIGs just what destruction he can accomplish with words alone. Yet, this shared view of Starling causes us to momentarily overlook his evils, all the while providing an odd layer of humanity to what we previously deemed to be a monster. Take this scene for example. Clarice sneaks into Lecter's holding cell for one final attempt at uncovering Buffalo Bill's identity. Before she can obtain any answers, however, Lecter once again invokes quid pro quo, pressing her about her time as an orphan. She concedes, and at last, he manages to surface her innermost source of trauma, the screaming of spring lambs being slaughtered. She confesses her failed attempt to save one of the lambs, and Lecter draws the correlation between them and Buffalo Bill's victims. It's here that we witness Clarice at her most vulnerable. Yet, something interesting happens. Instead of capitalizing on his victory, Lecter becomes enveloped in emotion himself. Strangely enough, he, a murderer, manages to heal the wound that held Clarice back the most. At any point, he could have manipulated her with more malicious intent, or even led her to demise. But he doesn't. Instead, he even admits that the world's a more interesting place with her in it. Lecter's developed this uncanny way of winning us over that creates a point of both moral contention and introspective fear of self. I mean, who consciously wants to relate to a serial killer? It's a more anxiety-stimulating relationship than that lion and antelope couple from National Geographic. Through empathy, we fear the loss of innocence and the loss of humanity. But there's something missing from horror that I just can't quite put my finger on. Something unknown. The final element I'd like to address is that of the unknown. We've all experienced some variation of the day-night scenario where a commonly explored path by day becomes extremely unsettling at night. Since the visual information has been obscured, your remaining senses are forced to fill in the blanks by amplifying the responsiveness in compensation. Unfortunately, with the stimulus being ambiguous to sight, it's difficult for the brain to quickly contextualize its source, thus leaving imagination unchecked and leading to a fear response. So what would happen then if all your senses were available, but none of them could make sense of the situation? Welcome to Silent Hill. The Silent Hill franchise is well known for its employment of psychological horror, revolving around the mysterious, fog-ridden town in the northeastern United States of the same name. The third installment of which depicts the trials and tribulations of one Heather Mason. She awakens from a nightmare inside of a Panda Express, begging the question of when did the nightmare stop and reality begin? Shortly thereafter, before exiting the mall, she's confronted by a detective named Douglas Cartland. The man claims to have information regarding her birth. However, in a display of teen angst in all its glory, she evades the man by escaping through a bathroom window.
Well, nice talking to you.
Unfortunately, that little maneuver sent her straight into the Shadow Realm, aka the Otherworld, aka the Upside Down, aka I'll turn right back around, thank you, please. The ambiguous nature of the Otherworld generates fear by taking what we generally understand quite well and flipping it on its head. Everything from the score, to the visuals, to the characters work in tandem to deceive your senses and instill internal conflict. Let's take this joyous moment for example. Early on, it's established that Heather has a fear of mirrors. She equates them to harboring an unknown world on the other side, and that the person staring back isn't necessarily her, but merely an imitator. Later in the game, she finds herself navigating the Brookhaven Hospital when this happens.
Yikes.
Consciously, we know that blood doesn't flow that way and that reflections can't act independently of the reflectee. Yet, here they are, betraying all our earthly understanding of them. This ambiguous behavior is terrifying for us because we're such patternistic beings. We constantly seek out consistencies in life and deem them to be factual. But the mere suggestion of probability would threaten to unravel our woven set of truths. Now mix in that pre-existing phobia and the impressionable age, and you got yourself a brand new season of Fear Factor. Though I don't think Joe Rogan will be coming back for that one. Interestingly enough, Silent Hill can be played in the same manner this fear response. Meaning, you can choose to fight, or you can choose to fly. Most of the monster encounters can be evaded by simply running away. However, after logging several hours into the game, you may feel a bit dignified in ridding the earth of these otherworldly creations. That is, until the game hits you with this curveball.
Don't stand there looking so smug. You're the worst person in this room. You come here and enjoy spilling their blood and listening to them cry out. You feel excited when you step on them, snuff out their lives.
Are you talking about the monsters?
Monsters? Ah, they look like monsters to you?
Oh no.
Are we the baddies?
The game constantly makes you question, is any of this even real? Or is it all in my head? And it's for these reasons that ambiguity is one of the fundamental elements of horror. For nothing is scarier in the moment than the unknown. I thoroughly enjoy the horror genre, and honestly can see why most of us are so drawn to it. When you factor in just how comfortable life can be, fear is the motivator lacking from life that truly makes us feel like we're surviving. And as such, we tend to manifest it in other avenues, be it from projections of the future to work life to art. Anywho, I gotta take care of this little situation before we have a Walter White scenario on our hands, so I'll leave you with this. The next time you want to scare the bejesus out of somebody or write a 20-page Tumblr post, think about how you can utilize vulnerability, empathy, and ambiguity to your advantage. And of course, have a safe and happy indoor Halloween this year, if possible. He's doing the quirky little exit the frame thing, and then I'm stuck here. I miss my friends.